If you like the sweet science, get ready to talk boxing on the Gloved Fist podcast with top boxing writers Frank Lotierzo and Jack Hirsch. Frank, a former amateur boxer out of Philadelphia, writes for NY Fights and can be seen on the Boxing Channel. Jack, an amateur boxer who competed in the New York Golden Gloves, was a 6-term president of the Boxing Writers Association. And now, here's Frank Lotierzo and Jack Hirsch.
Welcome to Glove Fist to all you boxing fans out there, wherever you may be watching. My name is Frank Lotierzo, former fighter, part-time writer, and full-time observer. And I am joined by my co-host, Jack Hirsch, former 6-term Boxing Writers of America president. Do we have a fistful for you guys tonight? We have so much content to discuss tonight, we might need 2 hours. And Jack and I saw the Crawford-Porter fight from completely different ends of the universe. Jack, how you doing?
I'm fine, Frank. Listen, got back from Las Vegas last night, was ringside for Crawford Porter. It wasn't quite the exciting fight we thought it was going to be, but it was a good match. Nice, a fast-paced tactical contest. That's what I call it. Very interesting, high drama, until, Crawford pulled away at the end. But the outcome was kind of in doubt till the end.
I disagree with that. There was never a doubt in my mind that Porter was going to lose the fight. But go ahead, tell me what you saw. You were there.
Crawford in 9 rounds, you picked him by decision.
I didn't pick him. I said no, Jack, read my post. I said that Crawford would probably stop him, but if it went the distance, I wouldn't be surprised.
Oh, okay, Frank, I got to read your posts a little more because it is good stuff you have. You do it, got great insights. I got to give you that on that. Now,
tell us about the fight, and then I'll give you my take on it.
Let the official scorecards decide going into the 10th round. Crawford was only up 1 point on 2 of the cards, and on 1 point on my card, 3 points on the other. You could argue both ways, but Crawford hadn't established a level of dominance, I felt, till the 10th round. He started getting to Porter bid in that 9th round, nothing major, but you could sense he was taking control of the fight. But Porter was still very much in it when the bell rang to begin the 10th round. And the sudden ending, it happened quick. There wasn't an inclination that it was going to end that way a moment earlier.
All right, Jack, I had the fight. I had it 6-3 for Crawford, but I don't have a problem with anybody who had it 5-4 for Crawford. To me, the fight was like the Canelo Plant fight where it was kind of close on the rounds, but you had no inkling at all that Plant could win, and I feel the same way.
No, it's different. Don't insult Sean Porter by comparing Plant.
Jack, I'm not doing that, and I'm going to tell you why I was very impressed with him. And here's why the fight was closer than it was. Everybody said before the fight that Porter, including myself, for Porter to have a shot, he had to come out like gangbusters, get Crawford's attention, and he had to rough him up. However, here's what Porter did that was very smart, and although it didn't get him the fight, it enabled him to go rounds, and that is he came out jabbing, and he mixed his aggression. Sometimes he was all the way in. Sometimes he made Crawford chase him. Now, in doing that, that enabled him to go more rounds because it took away Crawford's ability to counterpunch. He made Crawford come to him. And by doing that, he could time him and try to catch him with a shot coming in, which he tried to do. And the other thing is, by him bringing Crawford to him and then making that run, he was there to tie him up, and he did that. What happened as the fight progressed, Crawford forced him to open up more, and that's when he started to take it to him, and that's when he started to get him. But I'll tell you this, Crawford fought one of the best fights of his career. Porter maybe never fought a smarter fight, and it just goes to show that Crawford can punch, Jack, because as you saw, he was only grazing him for the first
punch. He didn't have to.
Yeah, he was only grazing him for like the first 8 rounds, but once he started to connect, you could tell he hurt Porter, and the end was near. Again, You want to have it 5-4, 6-3. I don't have a problem with that.
Tell you, out of the 9 rounds scored, the judges unanimously agreed in 8 of the 9 rounds. That's highly unusual to have that type of uniformity.
And Porter was ahead after 5 rounds, which I don't have a problem with.
Yeah, well, listen, it was deemed irrelevant in the 10th round. How did you feel about the stoppage? Do you feel
I was surprised, Jack, that Mr. Porter stopped the fight. I understand why he did. I don't have a big problem with it. What I have a bigger problem with is him saying that he didn't like the way Sean prepared for the fight. I didn't like that at all because I don't think he ever fought better or smarter. But I think it was a little quick, but I don't think Porter escapes the round.
I wouldn't question his dad. His dad has been with him from the beginning, his amateur career through the pro ranks. The two of them are extraordinarily close. Sean Porter's had the ultimate faith in his dad his whole career. And right. I think when he says his son didn't quite prepare, it wasn't maybe so much putting in the time, because Sean Porter probably put in the time, but that certain drive, that certain enthusiasm, when you start losing that, it doesn't matter how many hours you put in the physical training. And what was revealing after the fight, Sean Porter said he basically checked out after the Errol Spence fight, but then he thought there's one more fight I should take that was missing from my resume, that I should take the Crawford fight. It was more like he felt an obligation to fight Crawford than a burning desire to.
But Jack, this was a legacy fight for him, and if he wins this fight, he basically makes amends for his 3 previous defeats. Well, I don't think Porter has an off year.
Wait a second. He made amends in the way when you look at the victories. He beat Ugas, the guy who's a belt holder who beat Pacquiao. He beat Danny Garcia. You know, he had other good wins over guys like Paulie Malignaggi, etc. The question,
and Bronner, you're right.
But you're right, Frank. I agree with you on this point with the legacy fight. If Porter would have won Saturday night, he would be a Hall of Famer going to Canastota. I think that would have got him over the top. The way things stand now, you never know how the voters are going to vote, what they're thinking, but I feel he falls a little short, you know, at a Hall of Fame in Canastota. I can't look at him as a Hall of Famer that way.
I wouldn't be surprised if he got in eventually, but I think off the top of my head, you may be right, but he's well-liked. That's going to help him. And then, Jack, if you look at his resume, in a way, he kind of carried the welterweight division. I mean, he fought everybody, and that's why this fight was so important for Crawford, because nobody handled him. Nobody handled him. His 3 losses were very, very close. The Spence fight was the closest, and then in this fight, yeah, on the scorecards, it was close, but to me, I don't think he ever was a threat to win. It was just a matter when Crawford was going to open up.
Well, Crawford had 2 opponents, Spence and the rest of the division. This was a comparison fight. That's why I was saying going into the 10th round, Crawford, even though I had him ahead of 5 rounds to 4, he was losing the fight as far as I was concerned. He was on his way to getting a decision.
Right.
But if he was going to get a decision 7 rounds to 5, 115, 113, or thereabouts, to me, he was going to be a loser that night. He had to distinguish himself from Errol Spence, from Keith Thurman, from Ugas, all the guys that Porter had fought before. And I think by stopping Porter in the 10th round, he distinguished himself. I mean, and as far as Crawford goes, he went to a whole different level for the first time in his career. Now they can't avoid him with nonsense. We can't hear Errol Spence, who ducked him before, saying, oh, I'll fight him, but it's got to be a 75-25 split.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
Crawford is bigger than Spence is right now. He is a bigger attraction. He's worth more financially now than Spence is.
Jack, I was so impressed with Crawford's diversity and how when Porter did make his runs, how he was moving and making him miss and then countering him with that right hook to the head on the way out. I really, really think Crawford just showed that he is the best fighter in the game today, and the argument begins with who's number 2.
Well, if you look at Canelo's resume, all the guys he's fighting, I mean, it's a fair argument. Listen, you talk about what comes next. And
Jack, wait 1 second. Hold that thought. I'm going to tell you why I don't think it's that close. You can make a case. Canelo's fought more higher quality opponents, but you could make a case that Canelo has 4 losses. He lost to Mayweather. Many people thought he lost to Lara. He clearly lost the first Golovkin fight. And there are people that think he lost the second one too. Okay? He has had a lot of close calls where on behalf of Crawford, he's gone through 3 weight divisions and he has not had one close call. He's more stylistically diverse than Canelo. And he's flashy. He's a knockout guy. I think he's more fun to watch, and I think he has the best case. And also, look at the one common opponent Crawford and Canelo have. Amir Khan. Crawford fought him at his more idealistic weight and actually beat him easier. I don't think there's a case for Canelo over Crawford.
Let me tell you, we both know Canelo, if he could make 160 pounds, Canelo, even though he fought super middleweight. He could make 160. We agree on that. Without weakening himself, I feel, Canelo. Could you imagine they did it the way they did in the past with 8 weight divisions? Because Crawford did mention something about fighting Canelo. It may have just been talk. He did it before, the Porter fight. Can you imagine Crawford and Canelo? Canelo gets down to 160 and Crawford, would weigh in about 155 for the fight, and he actually had that fight, how big it would be.
It really would be a big fight, Jack, for the fans. For me, as much as I love Crawford, it wouldn't excite me that much because the funny thing about matching them is they are both vulnerable to what the other guy does. Canelo can be outboxed. You're not going to blast him through. Where I think Crawford, I don't think he can be outboxed. And I think when we see him get beat, I think it'll be by a guy who is just physically stronger than him.
I want to answer this question. Does Aram sign Crawford? Now, Crawford is the equivalent of a free agent. This was his last fight with Top Rank. He could re-sign with them. Think of a superstar player whose contract has run out with a team. All the promoters are going to fawn over Crawford, and there's going to be this one mega fight they're going to offer him at the end of the rainbow. Now, people are assuming the best bet for Crawford is to go to Al Heyman and the PBC because they have a so-called stranglehold on the top welterweights. But who are the top welterweights they have? Porter's out of the picture. Danny Garcia wouldn't excite anyone at all. That would be just a keep busy fight for Crawford.
Right.
So now you talk about Keith Thurman and Errol Spence. Errol Spence had the auto accident, the detached retina, plus he has a case of Crawforditis. He's scared at, Crawford based on his...
And Thurman is all over social media saying he'd be glad to fight
Thurman
Crawford.
is more of a businessman, and Crawford-Thurman is a nice fight to make, but it's not blockbuster. But Bob Arum, he keeps talking about the one fight that he can offer Crawford. And if he puts pen to paper on the money guarantee, Josh Taylor in the UK, that would be off the charts in the UK.
That would do 70,000 people live.
Josh Taylor would be in with a chance. Josh, not just because it's in the UK. Let's assume everything is going to be up and up in the UK because fighters do get a fair shake in the UK out of towners, despite what people think. They don't get ripped off in the UK. It's not that type of a country on balance. But Crawford, I mean, it would be chancy. You go to the big arena, but I'll tell you, and I got to tell you a little Josh Taylor story with Crawford. I think I may have mentioned it before, but I'll say it again. 12 days before Carl Frampton fought Leo Santa Cruz at the Barclays Center, I was having lunch with his team because I was friendly with his manager at the time, Barry McGuigan. It's Barry McGuigan, his son Shane McGuigan, Carl Frampton, and some of the young fighters they had in their stable. One of them was Josh Taylor. Now, who knew? Josh Taylor was just a prelim guy who was fighting at the Barclays Center then. And he was talking about the Crawford-Victor Postal fight. And Josh Taylor was saying the way he thought Postal was going to beat Crawford. And, of course, Carl Frampton said, no, Crawford is special. He's going to win. But just the idea that Josh Taylor was thinking Victor Postal would beat Crawford, he might not be overly impressed with Crawford, even though Crawford won that fight decisively. It's not like he has this hero worship of Crawford. Josh Taylor would really believe he could beat him if the match would be made. And what a fight that would be.
That's the mindset to have if you're fighting Crawford. They could promote it as the two guys that unified the junior welterweight title. However, in my opinion, it'll be a big fight. It'll make money, but there's only one way it could end. It won't go the distance. And after a couple rounds, Josh Taylor will be fighting for his life. But yes, I would like to see it. I don't know how much credit Crawford would get for beating him, but it would be a nice pay fight, and it would be fun to see.
I'm going to tell you, I don't think they can make it immediately. I mean, if there's time, we'll discuss it a little later. But Teofimo Lopez is fighting George Kambosos Saturday night. If Lopez should win sensationally, okay, it would magnify his win over Lomachenko. He fights for top rank, Lopez. They might very well match him with Josh Taylor in a big mega fight. And if Josh Taylor would win that fight the way I think he would, okay, and especially if he did it decisively, it makes him and Crawford an off-the-charts matchup. And we look at people would look at Josh Taylor differently, like he was in with a real chance in a fight like that, because Josh Taylor's very aggressive, likes to crowd opponents, and maybe he would smother Crawford.
I'm not sure that boosts the fight, Jack. And you know what? I'm not sure that Lopez takes that fight. And I don't know how much credit
Lopez
Taylor gets for beating a lightweight coming up to junior welterweight, and then how that gets him ready for Crawford. But look, Taylor doesn't need to do anything else. He's already in the mix to fight Crawford if he does, if the finances work out. I don't think that would be a competitive fight. And I'm going to tell you this about Crawford. This is how much I think of him. And I'm telling you right now, I will never be able to validate it. But I really wish that Floyd Mayweather was around in his prime, because if there was a fighter out there who had all the needed tools to beat Mayweather anywhere from 135 to 147, it's Terence Crawford. They can never fight. And I don't think Crawford's going to retire undefeated, so he'll never win the barroom argument. But I actually think that Crawford is a better fighter than Mayweather on many levels.
You're going to a territory where, if we're going to expand it, Frank, it's hard to make the case for Crawford right now. Let's wait when he's in bigger fights.
Wait a second, make the case for Crawford over Mayweather?
What? Listen, could you make a case for Crawford over Sugar Ray Leonard?
No, but I think it would be a hell of a fight.
Make a case for Crawford over Tommy Hearns at welterweight.
Jack, you're talking about two of the top 5 greatest all-time welterweights. I don't think Crawford's there yet, but I don't think Mayweather is a top 10 welterweight. Jack, let me ask you this. How would Mayweather beat Crawford? He can't hurt him. He's not faster. He doesn't hit as hard. Of the two of them, Crawford has more layers to his game. But I think he would just bring Mayweather out of that shell.
Able to hit Mayweather. He had a hard time at times landing on Sean Porter. Mayweather.
But what would Mayweather do, Jack? Would he land every punch? No, but he would be able to make him come out of that shell and fight. But if Mayweather goes strictly on defense, no, but he's not going to win because he's not an offensive fighter. Crawford didn't get hit that much the other night against Porter. And I'll tell you what, if that Porter was in with the best Mayweather we saw at welterweight, Porter loses 7-5 in rounds, is never hurt one time. I'm telling you, he's a terrible matchup for Mayweather, but he'll never get the benefit of the doubt because Mayweather is undefeated, and that ends all the arguments. At least with this group of young boxing fans.
I'm not saying what would happen between Crawford and Mayweather. I'm just saying, let's see Sean Crawford in some big, Terence Crawford, excuse me, in some bigger fights. I've watched him his whole career. He's been outstanding, but through no fault of his own, he's been in against overmatched opponents for the most part. Even Amir Khan, by the time he beat Amir Khan, Khan was past his best. There wasn't a young version of Amir
Okay,
Khan.
Jack, then give me the great guy Mayweather beat in their prime.
No, listen, I'm not making a comparison. You wanted to make
it kind of sounds like you are. Well, I can make a case for all of Mayweather's big fights, except for Castillo.
I could say Wilfred Benitez would have beaten Crawford. Benitez was
that's plausible. He would have beat Mayweather too. But Jack, look at Mayweather. Look at Mayweather's signature fights. Jack, look at Mayweather's signature fights. Okay. Nobody knew who he was until he fought De La Hoya. He beat De La Hoya. Let me finish. He beat De La Hoya 7 years after Shane Mosley peppered him at the same weight. He didn't beat him as convincingly as Mosley did. And then he beats Mosley, 8 years after Vernon Forrest schooled him twice at the same weight. Move on. Then he fights Cotto 3 or 4 years after Pacquiao destroyed him, and he gave Mayweather a tough fight. And then he fights Pacquiao 3 years after Marquez knocked him out for a month. But it's just whenever Mayweather beats a guy that lost 4 or 5 times before him, it's earth-shattering and it's legacy-making. I'm telling you, he beat one guy in his prime who was undefeated.
Canelo Alvarez was pro for 7-8 years when he fought Mayweather. Canelo Alvarez was already a champion. He beat Erislandy Lara and Austin Trout. And I give Canelo a ton of credit to fight guys who had a nightmare style for him, but yet he took them on.
Mayweather has a style to give.
But the point is,
Canelo trouble, Jack. But he made him come down to 152. And look at this. Mayweather is moving up the cruiserweight. How effective could he have been at 152? But Mayweather was smart to fight him before he was real good. Just like I think that Crawford could pull the same move now, because to me,
but let's get off. Mayweather's retired. To me, he's old news in that sense. You know, we admire his accomplishments within whatever perspective of
Jack, I'm just making a comparison about how good Crawford is and how at this time there is only one welterweight walking this planet who has a chance to give him a fight, and that's Jaron Ennis.
Okay, that's what I meant to get on next. How do you think Crawford does it? Let's talk reality here, because Crawford's never going to fight Mayweather. We could go in circles. It's really totally irrelevant. But
wait a second. Wait. What did Chris Reyna say? Let's be honest. What would Porter have been in the 90s? A journeyman? Really? How about Mayweather? What would he have been at welterweight in the 90s if he had to fight prime Trinidad, prime Corte, and prime De La Hoya? He barely beat a fossil of De La Hoya. Go ahead, Jack.
Okay, what about Crawford and Errol Spence? That's the fight that people really want to see. You give Spence a reasonable chance in the fight. You'd be picking Crawford, I know that. But what type of chance do you give Spence? Because I'll tell you, before Spence had the auto accident, and those difficulties, him and Crawford, to me, was a 50-50 fight. I was even thinking at one point that Crawford's the more talented of the two guys, but Errol Spence is technically better. And I gave him a decent chance of beating Crawford. That's when Spence was riding high. Now, after the auto accident, he beat Danny Garcia decisively, something like 9 rounds to 3. That was a good win for him. It showed Errol Spence was back. Then he had the detached retina. But let's say he's the same Errol Spence, which he very well might be. How do you see that?
I'd make it probably a 65-35 fight in favor of Porter. I think Porter in favor of Crawford. I think that Crawford does everything better than Spence. And you say Spence is better technically. I'm not sure about that. I think he's more fundamental and he's not as diverse.
Fundamentally better. Yeah, fundamentally
but
better.
I don't think that makes a difference regarding how he beats Crawford.
But listen, Crawford tends in his fights to start slowly. Okay?
You're right. He's a boxer, Jack.
Right, unless you're going to come on and stop your opponent. If you can't stop him later on or take control in the second half of the fight, those rounds could come back to haunt you.
But Jack, what is Spence in his big fights? He goes in behind his jab. He doesn't come in with reckless abandon and try to get you out. He comes in behind his jab, and I'll tell you what, if it's a jabbing contest, I like Crawford. And to answer Lyman's question, how about prime Jose Luis Lopez? You know what? That was a very, very underrated welterweight back in the day. That, you know what? He could live with anybody today. He wouldn't beat Crawford. I'm not sure about Spence, but he'd be a player today. There's no doubt about it, Lyman. But
Okay,
again, Jack, I would favor Crawford to beat Spence.
Over the weekend, listen, it was a privilege for me watching Crawford at ringside. I've seen him at ringside a good number, the first fights in New York. But seeing him in Vegas, him and Porter, it seemed to me like the fight would have been better off in New York than Vegas. And you want to hear the ironic part about it, which kind of stunned me being there. Sean Porter, I know he was born in Ohio, but he lives in Las Vegas.
Vegas, yes.
That's his hometown. Crawford had more support than Porter. The people who made the trip from Omaha made more noise than the fans from Las Vegas. So Porter, unfortunately, wasn't adopted by, the town of Las Vegas.
But Jack, if you think about where they're from, Ohio has a lot more things going on. What does Nebraska have other than the Corn Huskers? And what are they, a 500 team? At least in Ohio, you've got a couple of football teams that they root for.
He's their franchise in Nebraska, in Omaha, when you think of it, Crawford. And it's kind of unusual, Frank, how many fighters of that talent level come out of Nebraska? It's so rare. I mean, the Nebraska Wildcat, Ace Hudkins comes to mind, but it's a rarity where some of these states that
good point, Chris,
is in a hotbed where they get, a talent like that. Listen, there was another fight over the weekend, the night before Crawford and Porter, a guy we've debated about, Frank, and argued about, who I'm extremely high on, who I'm saying point blank is the one fighter out there who would beat Canelo, okay? At a catch weight, let's say 164, 160, whatever.
But that won't happen because Canelo calls his shot, so he's not going to give Andrade any advantage.
Okay, but Andrade, I wasn't overly impressed by his win over Jason Quigley. Jason Quigley is levels below Andrade. They could fight 100 times and it would never be close. And we knew that, but the attitude Andrade showed I liked. He's had guys down in his fights and then they've survived. He made it a point to finish Quigley quick because you have to kind of look sensational against opponents like that.
And he really put his shots together against Quigley. Granted, they could have pulled Mickey Ward out of the stands and he might have given them a better fight. But there's no denying Andrade's talent. He showcased it. He put everything together. I really like the way he put his punches together. He did a good post-fight interview. He made a strong case for himself. And all I can say is this, Jack. Andrade, there's one fight I want to see him in. I'm not sure who I would pick, but I really do think the middleweight division needs to see Andrade and Jamal Charlo face each other.
Well, the problem is promotional entities, unfortunately. Andrade fights for Matchroom, Eddie Hearn, and Charlo fights for Al Heyman, the PBC. And the only time they'll do business, different promotional groups, if they can't match their fighters from within. Like Sean Paul fights for the PBC, but they had no one to match him with. He fought all those guys. He fought Spence. He fought Thurman. He fought Danny Garcia.
Ugas.
He fought Ugas. So Al Heyman's thinking, let's cash out with them.
That's what they did.
Cash out. So they let Bob Arum, promote him. And Bob Arum's top rank. They desperately needed a name opponent for Crawford. That's why they were able to make the fight. But I agree with you. Jamal Charlo, Demetrius Andrade, great matchup. But even if the fighters want it, could it be made? I mean, Eddie Hearn said he's never had as difficult a time getting opponents for fighter as he's had with Andrade. Simply no one wants to fight him. Because
I'll take what Eddie Hearn says with a grain of salt, but I get the message. But he and Charlo have to get together. They have to sort the middleweight division out because Canelo is not going back there. As Lyman said, he's not going back to middleweight. And that is the one thing that Canelo did by accepting the cruiserweight fight. That sort of makes the guys underneath them have to fight because they can't sit and run the clock out waiting for the lottery fight because now it's not there. Now they have to earn it.
I got to kind of laugh at Canelo's attitude. He sees his opponent, what's his name, Junior, whatever. Okay, Frank, I'm having forget the guy who he's fighting. And Canelo, with a smile on his face, is saying, hey, he's a big guy. I know I can lose this fight. It's a 50-50 fight, Canelo is saying. If Canelo really thought he was a threat, Canelo would be talking big.
He wouldn't be fighting him. I agree.
If he was fighting Andrade, Canelo would say, I'm going to knock him out. I'm going to destroy him. But he's fighting a guy, I'm sure they have a book, a very good book on the guy Canelo's fighting. And you want to know something, Frank? Fights like that, anyway, I don't think a guy's daring to be great when he takes a leap up like that. Because if Canelo should lose, that's a ready-made excuse that, he's moved up all these divisions. And they got that excuse.
There's no pressure, and it's monumental if he wins.
And if he wins, right, they're going to make such a big deal out of it. And
But Jack, think about this. If Canelo didn't have a chin, he couldn't do this. He's like James Toney. Because he has such a good chin, he can go up and fight bigger guys and not worried about getting brushed or grazed and knocked out. And then at that weight, he's the quicker guy, the better boxer, and he has an advantage. Let's face it, whenever the smaller guy moves up, he's usually the more skilled fighter. And if he has a chin, that really gives him an advantage.
I saw one of your posts, Frank, which was pretty insightful, but you left one fight out. It wasn't a big one. You pointed out, and it was thought-provoking, it was good stuff, that whenever a smaller guy picks a bigger guy and hand picks him, he usually always beats him because he's hand picking him. There was one case where a smaller guy picked on a light heavyweight. Remember Eddie Mustafa Hamid
fighting Snipes?
Ronaldo Snipes. He kind of, I'm not sure was that hand picking, but the bigger guy won that fight, Ronaldo Snipes. So it doesn't always.
It's not always that way, but remember this. Eddie wasn't the star that Canelo is, and he kind of had to be the name guy because if I remember correctly, didn't Snipes fight Holmes after that fight? And see, Eddie was angling for a fight with Holmes, and I think he thought if he could beat Snipes, he'd get the fight with Holmes.
Yeah, it was a different element. You're right. I mean, Canelo's a star, so to really make that type of...
And Jack, that's what I mean. When the star guys, when they can order what I call from the menu and fight the guy they want to fight, I mean, sometimes they lose. It seldom happens. Let's remember this, too. The guy I think is the greatest guy to ever put on a boxing glove, Sugar Ray Robinson, he kind of saw a soft touch with Joey Maxim, and he went for it. Where if Archie Moore was there at the time, I don't know if he goes that way because they were going to make the fight, but it was later.
No, you know what would have happened? Had Sugar Ray Robinson not collapsed from the heat at the end of the 13th round against Maxim, he was well on his way to winning the fight. Way ahead of points. Next would have been Rocky Marciano. That's what was...
No, think how huge that would have been.
Light heavyweight champions at that time always felt nearly obligated to try for the heavyweight title.
Right.
And they would have matched him with Rocky. And when you think of it, the weight difference, what would it have been? About 25 pounds or something when all was said and done?
But Jack, remember this. Marciano trained his rear end off to get to 186. He walked around a lot bigger than that. Robinson would have no shot beating Rocky.
You can never discount Sugar Ray Robinson. I would have picked Rocky at that time. He would have. He would have had no shot. None.
None. That would be like Canelo fighting Joshua to a degree. Even though the weight's bigger, Robinson could never hurt Marciano, and Marciano could cut the ring off. And if Walcott and Charles couldn't hold him off, Sugar Ray's not going to hold him off.
It was kind of may have been a blessing in disguise for Sugar Ray Robinson that he collapsed from the heat. It was the only time in the 202 fights in his career that he was stopped, where he didn't go the distance. And it wasn't a true stoppage. It was
no, they won't let him come out. He couldn't come out for the 14th
a couple
round.
of rounds before that, the referee Ruby Goldstein had to be removed from the ring because the heat was too
after the 10th round. Yes. Here's a great comparison. If you look at Robinson against Maxim before he retired and Maxim against Archie Moore, Robinson was having his way with Maxim more than Archie Moore was. But Jack, talking about pound for pound guys. This is our spotlight fire that we usually do every week. And the guy we're doing this weekend is the great Salvador Sanchez, who is the best featherweight of my lifetime, and that's following boxing adamantly since 1964. Sanchez, his career was cut short, got killed in a car accident about 2 weeks or 3 weeks before he turned 23. He had been featherweight champ
after the Azuma Nelson fight.
Yes, that was his last fight. He was about to fight Laporte again in a rematch, and there were big things down the road for Sanchez if he had won that fight and continued on. They were talking about maybe Aguayo down the road. There were some big fights for him, and all I can say this is about Salvador Sanchez. He may be the best water fighter I've ever seen.
The best fighter?
Water. And by that, I mean, do you remember the interview with Bruce Lee when he says the cup of water become the cup?
Yeah.
The water becomes the cup. What I mean by that is Sanchez could morph into whatever it took to beat his opponent. If they were a boxer, he would fight them. If they were a puncher, he would box them. He had a steel chin. He was always in great shape. And he had one of the best wins of the 80s when he destroyed the undefeated Wilfredo Gomez in the Battle of the Little Giants. I think that was in 1981 or 82.
In all fairness to Gomez, he wasn't the same fighter. He'd had a lot of substance abuse problems.
Not at that point, Jack. He was undefeated and he knocked everybody out.
No,
he was in his prime.
He'd had the problems. Yeah, when the matchup actually took place. But he was having the problems after. And then even though he had one last hurrah with Lupe Pintor, and that was a rugged war that could have gone either way until Gomez prevailed.
But he won some big fights after he fought Sanchez. And there was even talk of a rematch between them. And if you remember, I think going into that fight that Gomez was a slight favorite over Sanchez because he was 24-0-1 with all knockouts.
Sanchez was his, if I compare him to another Mexican. You could say he was his era's Julio Cesar Chavez. He was as good in his time as Chavez was in his time late on. That's a fair.
Yeah, Chavez just had the longer run.
Right, but the thing is, greatest featherweight, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to argue against it in all fairness of let's say the last 50 years. I mean, we could argue back and forth, but I will say this. When he beat Azuma Nelson only had about a week to prepare. He came in as a late sub, and the fight was even going into the 15th round. But in fairness,
but Sanchez hurt, Jack. I've heard you say this before. Sanchez had him hurt a few times in that fight, and don't tell me that the best Nelson beats the best Sanchez.
But that version of Nelson was even as
he got a little better. I'll give you that.
Going into the 15th round when Sanchez turned up the heat and he got Nelson out of there.
In the 15th round. And I agree with what Chris said. Sanchez, and that's what I mean, Chris, by a water fighter. Sanchez transitioned beautiful from defense to offense. He was great against punchers and guys that brought the fight to him. 10-0 in title fights, Jack. We really missed out on what a career he could have had by his life being cut short.
You know what? When I think of Salvador Sanchez, I compare him to, let's say, a James Dean. who died at an early age, and you don't know potential, I mean, he established himself as a great, great fighter, and Salvador Sanchez established a great legacy. But we don't really know what he would have been after. He could have continued it. And if we were talking about the 10 greatest fighters pound for pound of all time, maybe Sanchez eventually, we would have looked at him the same way we look at, let's say, Roberto Duran.
You know what the problem is, though, Jack? We just don't know where to put him, because as great as he was at featherweight, he was only 5'7", and I have to be honest, even at that time, I always felt his ceiling weight class was probably going to be lightweight at the most. I can't see him ever going up and beating the great guys at 140, but at 135, I think that would have been his ceiling. I don't know if he beats Aguayo, but I would have liked to see the fight.
What would have eventually happened, Frank, and I'm not sure how it would have turned out, Sanchez would have had a legacy fight. Sometimes those legacy fights take a guy to a higher level than he could have ever dreamed of, and sometimes they hurt great fighters because we don't look at their whole career. We magnify the legacy fight. An example would be Alexis Arguello. Great, great fighter. To me, an all-time great. But we look at his legacy fights against Aaron Pryor, and he lost those fights. So when we think of the short list of the greatest of all time, Arguello falls a little outside that list because of the legacy fights.
Jack, do you really think that's
Sanchez? Eventually, Sanchez would have had those fights.
But Sanchez did have a legacy fight with Gomez. That was his legacy fight, and that was a big fight. That was one of the few fights where he had a featherweight, and it was pay-per-view.
I agree.
As far as Aguayo losing his legacy fights, everybody remembers the prior fights, but he beat Escalera twice. He beat Ruben Olivares. He had some good signature wins.
Oh, no, listen, Frank, I agree with you 100%. We're on the same page, but we're talking about the public. What pops into your head? I mentioned Alexis Arguello to a boxing fan. They're going to say, oh, Aaron Pryor.
A casual boxing fan, yes.
They are not going to ever link him to Alfredo Escalera, as great as the fights were. To a smaller degree, they might remember Boom Boom Mancini, but they're not going to link Arguello to that fight. I mentioned the name of Marvin Hagler. You're going to say Leonard and Hearns. You're not going to talk John Mugabe. You're not going to talk Alan Minter. You're not going to really talk Vito Antuofermo. That's what I mean by
Jack. I agree.
Legacy.
That was the fight that most people saw, and I think casual fans would think of that. But I think real boxing fans, I just think they look at Arguello against Pryor, and that was just a bridge too far, because anybody else, any other junior welterweight champ in that era, Arguello beats, but Pryor was a bad matchup.
You're right about the Wilfredo Gomez fight. That was Sanchez's biggest legacy fight. But there were other good wins. There were the 2 wins over, the
Lopez.
Guy in front of him, Danny Little Red Lopez. But when we think of the great moments of his career, we don't think of the workmanlike dominance that Sanchez showed over Danny Little Red Lopez.
He owned him.
He was a heck of a fighter, Lopez, but Sanchez handled him with comparative ease. We think of the sensational knockout.
Lopez was a Hall of Famer, but not an all-time great. But look at the guys Sanchez beat: Lopez, Castillo, Azuma, Gomez, Patrick Cadell, Hector Correz. He fought a lot of good guys. Laporte. He beat a lot of good guys. We didn't see a whole lot of Sanchez, Jack, but what we did see in that little window, he covered a lot of ground.
I got to tell you, too, they asked Roy Jones the 5 best fighters he's ever seen fight, and he put Sanchez in the top 5. This is Roy Jones. And I remember Bob Foster, totally from a different planet from Sanchez, different weight class. They asked him once who what the best fighters he ever saw. He said Sanchez was like a machine. That's what Bob Foster.
Jack, he really was a technician, and he had a steel chin. He never got tired. You never saw the guy fluster. And let's face it, we probably didn't even see his best at featherweight.
Greatest Mexican fighter of your lifetime, Frank, who you saw. Was it Julio Cesar Chavez, Salvador Sanchez, Ruben Olivares, Canelo Alvarez? I
think that overall Sanchez was the best fighter of those four, Jack, but he doesn't quite have the legacy because, he was only champ for 2 years, even though he had 10 title fights. But it's close. But you know what? Maybe when Canelo's done, they're going to say it's him.
I'm glad we can remember Sanchez on this show. Let's talk a little Teofimo Lopez, George Kambosos, because the fight's this Saturday in New York. George Kambosos is not too well known by the casual boxing fan or Australian. He might be real good. I mean, he beat Lee Selby, as I recall, but we don't know how good Kambosos really is. We're going to find out Saturday. Sometimes a fighter comes out of nowhere and he shocks us, wins.
We saw that with Jeff Horn, yes. Right. Even though that was a bad decision.
Another Mexican fighter, Emmanuel Navarrete, he came out of nowhere, and won a title. But, okay, let's assume this is Teofimo Lopez's first fight since Lomachenko. So he hasn't built on that. But, of course, he can still build on it. If he beats Kambosos, who he says he's going to knock out in one round or whatever, but any type of dominant performance, where does Lopez go next? Because reportedly, and it's been this way for a while, he has difficulty making the weight.
Right, and we've heard that for a while. Jack, there are so many fights for him at 135 and 140. I guess he's just going to go to bet money.
If he's going to go fight at 135, logically, it has to be Lomachenko, because Lomachenko, on two accounts. One, they're both promoted by Top Rank, so it's an easy fight to make. Number two, it's going to pay him more money than if he fought Devin Haney, Ryan Garcia, Tank Davis. Lomachenko's would be more the money machine. But does he go back? Does he stay at 135? Does it give him a ready-made excuse if he loses, he couldn't make the weight? He's a growing guy. I hate when fighters strain to make weight. I hate it. They're damaging themselves. So logically, Teofimo's big fight would be against Josh Taylor. But if you were handling the career of Teofimo Lopez, would you advise him to go to the UK in that territory? Isn't he enough of a star himself beating Lomachenko where he doesn't have to do that? What would you
Jack, you could say that, but I think between the difficulty with the weight, and I'm getting the impression that Lopez is a little more a businessman fighter than he lets on to be, and that's basically based on him not wanting to fight Lomachenko again, because I think he looks at that, even though if you're right, now I'm not sure you are, but you could be, that's the most money. I really do think him fighting Lomachenko again is too risky, and he has nothing to gain and everything to lose. So I think they're going to really pick their spots. But I will tell you this, if I was managing his career and he could still make lightweight, that's where I would keep him. I would not go near Josh Taylor because I think that's a bad style matchup for him, and I don't think he wins that fight. If I were him, I would try to clean out the lightweight division, and I would try to sick Tank and let him fight Lomachenko.
No, some fights can't get made. Some fights can't get made. Tank Davis is being promoted by your favorite fight of all time, Floyd Mayweather, okay? And Floyd
But I wouldn't be surprised if we saw, here's what we can say, and you're right about the promotion. If the day comes that Davis agrees to fight Lomachenko, Lomachenko is ready to be beat.
But the thing about it, I don't see Mayweather Promotions allowing him to go in with Teofimo Lopez, Tank Davis.
That's another risky fight. You're right.
Ryan Garcia would be an intriguing fight, but Ryan Garcia has had some emotional issues that have kept him inactive. We wish him well. So he has other things to deal with. He fights for Golden Boy Promotions, a different group. Would they do business with Top Rank? I mean, again, the problem, different promotional group. Devin Haney fights for Matchroom. And I mentioned with Eddie Hearn before, saying he's never had as difficult a time getting opponents as he has with Demetrius Andrade. With Devin Haney, it's difficult to get top guys to fight him because he's that good. He's fighting Jojo Diaz. He should win that fight handily. But what could be next for Devin Haney? I could see Eddie Hearn and Matchroom absolutely wanting to co-promote, make some type of deal to go in with Teofimo Lopez. And besides, we've seen the two of them going face-to-face arguing on social media. It would be a very intriguing fight. It would be a very lucrative fight. Haney and Lopez, two young stars like that colliding.
I would love to see that fight, Jack. You know what? Eventually these guys, see, I don't think any of these top welterweights, I don't think none of them or any one of them could go undefeated against all the others. But I think they have to fight each other and start doing the Duran, Hearns, Hagler, Leonard thing to make money and to bring some fans in. But that's what they have to do, and we could have great fights for the next 5 or 6 years. But again, all these guys are afraid to take the risk and get the L, and that's why we love Sean Porter so much, because he fought everybody.
I'm going to tell you, well, Sean Porter isn't a mega star, but I'll tell you, I always kind of wondered how
he could have been if he won some of those close fights.
Yeah, how boxing history would have been altered had Sugar Ray Leonard fought Tommy Hearns in the way up. They had proposed a 10-rounder in Rhode Island before either was a champion. And Mike Trainer, Leonard's manager, agreed to the match. Emmanuel Stewart, Hearns' trainer-manager, agreed to the match. Angelo Dundee said publicly he put a stop to it. He thought it was too early, the fight should grow. I kind of feel had they met a couple of years before they actually fought, let's say 3 years before they actually fought, Hearns would have outpointed him over 10 rounds.
Jack, I think that's very plausible. I think that Leonard having the 2 fights with Duran before he fought Hearns helped him a lot.
Yeah.
I really do. And the thing you just said about the Hearns and Leonard fighting early, you know, they tried to make Joe Frazier and Jerry Quarry back in '67 after they sparred, and Yank Durham's the one that says, you know what, Joe? Let's wait till one of you have the title. It'll be for more money, and you'll be better then.
Very smart. Also, I'll tell you, people don't realize that when Ali was unjustly stripped of the title in 1967, when they had the 8-man elimination tournament, Joe Frazier was the only one of the 8 who refused to enter. He was substituted by another Philadelphian from your turf, Leo Smart. But the point is, Yank Durham maybe had some little doubts whether Frazier was completely ready. I thought maybe let's put it another way. He thought it was maybe a little risky and there was no need to go down that route. But when you look at the names, Frazier got around to, you know, beating him anyway to Jerry Quarry.
Yank Durham pulled him out and he goes, we'll beat the winner, if I remember correctly. Right. And he was fighting Buster Mathis for the New York title, which was a big deal at the time. Jack, let's look to our anniversary fight.
Yes.
Evander Holyfield and Riddick Bowe fought 3 times. 2 times the title was on the line. I'll just go through this real quick, and this is why I love Holyfield. And if Anthony Joshua had some Holyfield in him, he'd be a better fighter. That's a clip of the first fight. Going into the first fight, Jack, Evander did not think much of Bowe, and the smaller guy chased the bigger guy down, and Holyfield got hurt. Doing that, he loses the title. They fight a year later. Holyfield totally reinvents himself, and now he's the boxer bouncing, circling around. He beats Bowe by a split decision by boxing. That was the fight with the Fan Man. And then 2 years later, they fight in an elimination bout. They both were down in the fight. And in that fight, it was a battle of jabs for the first couple rounds. And then they started to mix it up. But at that time, Bowe was just too big for Holyfield. Evander started to tire around the 6th round. Even after he dropped Bowe, he couldn't finish him. After that, they had a big exchange. Bowe stopped. He knocked him down. Holyfield beat the count. He gets up. Bowe cuffs him, knocks him down again. Joe Cortez stops the fight. but that is one of the better heavyweight trilogies, and there haven't been a lot of them in heavyweight history. And when I watched the third fight today, preparing for the show, and I'll tell you what, it made me think. All I was thinking about was how Holyfield, a guy that was 213, 215, how he fought big. And then I think of Anthony Joshua at 240, 45, how he fights little. And if you could just take Holyfield's mindset and grit and put it in Joshua, you'd have a hell of a fighter.
This warms my heart. Last Thursday, Holyfield was in New York City for the Atlas Foundation dinner later that night. But I was leaving to Las Vegas, and I hadn't finished my packing. And one of Holyfield's business associates, who's a good friend of mine, called me up and asked, did I want to join them for lunch, at a van.
Right.
They thought I'd get a kick out of it. And I wouldn't go. I had to pack, Frank, to get to Vegas. But with Holyfield, something stands out that Max Kellerman told me years ago. He said Holyfield was a greater fighter than Lennox Lewis. The only reason Lewis could have the success he did was Holyfield because of size.
Max was exactly right. I've said that for years.
Size. So the better fighter is Evander Holyfield, and Holyfield was at a major handicap fighting a guy as big as Bo.
And that always bothered me that Bo always wanted to pick on him. And think about Riddick Bowe, Jack.
Well,
that
is
his legacy fight.
No, you can't say picked on him. The first time they fought, Holyfield was a champ.
But what I'm saying is he never tried to fight Tyson when he was available or Lennox Lewis. He always picked on what he thought was a smaller guy.
Well, we know how Bo ducked Lennox Lewis. And Tyson had the prison stints. Believe me, they would have loved. In fact, Rock Newman and Bo visited Tyson when he was in prison, I guess to try to keep a relationship going. Anyone would want to fight Tyson only for the simple reason it was big money.
Right.
Certain guys, like we mentioned Canelo before, everyone would want to fight Canelo because it's big money. If you lose,
right,
you still win, at the end. But the Holyfield, I'll tell you, let's call him the greatest cruiserweight of all time.
Jack, I think he's the greatest cruiserweight ever, and I think he's a top 10 all-time heavyweight.
Which is interesting, his legacy as a heavyweight. I prefer to rate Holyfield on pound-for-pound lists instead of a divisional list, okay? I think he comes off better looking that way because, can you really rate Holyfield as a heavyweight ahead of, let's say,
Jack, he beat Mike Tyson twice. He beat Riddick Bowe. He stayed with Lennox Lewis even when Holyfield was old. He knocked Buster Douglas out with one punch. Old George Foreman, he was the first guy to really pepper him and tattoo him. I think Holyfield could live with any heavyweight from Sullivan through Tyson Fury.
Okay, listen, I can't.
The ultimate overachiever.
Yeah. When you talk about the guys who've overachieved in their career, took things to the max. You absolutely have to look at Holyfield. But, it's hard to rate the heavyweights. We should discuss it on a future show. A fighter like a Vladimir Klitschko, he didn't have the greatest opponents, but it wasn't his fault. All he could do was beat who was out there.
And he'd be a problem for the top 10 guys because of his size.
But the point is, how high can you rate him based on who he fought? And fighters, to achieve greatness, you need a dance partner. And
Jack, let me just say this. You're right. He didn't have great guys, but Vladimir held the title for 10 years. Not everybody sucks, and to continually beat guys at that level, you got to be pretty good. And since we're almost out of time, Jack, I'm going to let you finish up at the end. Let me just say this. Thanks to Joe Berman for watching. Art Caio, we're not going to make a pick on what round with Lopez, so you can go bet the fight, and then if we're wrong, you blame us. And Michael Lotierzo, you say you're hungry, you should be running around the block. You got to lose a couple pounds, pal. I'm done. I
guess I'm done too. I can't top you.
Chris Rain is a new watcher. Thanks, Chris.
Bringing along your fan club to watch this show.
Chris, you made some good points tonight. Thanks for watching.
Thank you to everyone for watching the show, whether you agree with us or not. And until next week, have a good week, and we'll have a lot to talk about. Have a happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Thank you.
Happy Thanksgiving.